Good morning to the Caron YouTube audience and to those of you who are here with us this morning. Again, a second good morning to anybody watching around the campus on our live stream. Privileged to be with you. A couple of calendar items caught my attention in alignment with our theme for the day, so I'd like to put that in front of us as a way of beginning. This happens to be the weekend of the Martin Luther King holiday tomorrow, and I'm sure you're all deeply aware that today is World Religions Day. No, probably not. In 1950, the Baha'i community, that's B-A-H-A apostrophe I, it's one of the wisdom traditions of the world, but little lesser known, pronounced that the third Sunday in January would be observed as World Religions Day. And this fits the Baha'i thing, and over the decades, there are other traditions and organizations that have kicked up World Religions Day. So it has some traction, but I'm almost said it isn't better known. If you want to know a little bit more about the Baha'i, one of the things that really I find fascinating and beautiful about them is their founding idea is around unity. So they speak of unity in God across the different wisdom traditions of the world, unity in religion, and unity in humankind. And what a peace-loving message. I'm not aware of any Baha'i involvement in war or strife, which I think is rather remarkable against most of the other wisdom traditions, I think, which get caught up in the swings. And it might not be that I know something, but anyway, they're peace-loving folks, and it's nice to think of them at any given time, and especially on a day today when they've added something to the interfaith calendars of the world. So, and the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Is a person that has an important place in my own development as a preacher. One of my preaching teachers was a fellow named Bobby McLean, who was a young pastor, knew Dr. King. And so I remember when I was in Bobby's preaching workshops, and they were practicums, that's what they called them, but they were really preaching workshops. I benefited immensely from this tradition of African American preaching, even though I don't necessarily carry a lot of the hallmarks of that style. And the oratory of Dr. King was second to none, I think. Just really remarkable, prophetic, and yet eloquently delivered. He was a master of anaphora, which is the use of a repeated phrase. I have a dream. Those kinds of things as a form of rhetoric. So, as both of those things were in my mind, I also collided with suffering as my chapel theme. It comes up in rotations, and I always try to figure out how to address these topics as they return to the calendar time and again. And I know it sounds weird, but I love the topic of suffering. I think it's really important. One of the things that quickly becomes evident as a practical theologian in taking a look at suffering is something that not only theological observers find, but that all of us discover, which is that suffering is a part of our existence. And I think it's very easy to naively, as a young buck or young person, to kind of contemplate how to eliminate sufferings from our lives, but that's sort of a fool's errand. In Buddhism, the founding patron of Buddhism bore the name Siddhartha Gautama. If you know the Siddhartha story, it's a beautiful story. Perhaps some mix of legend and truth, but anyway, the story is that Siddhartha was raised in an environment that protected him from suffering and found his way to break out of that and discovered an old man, a sick man, and a deceased person. And so aging, sickness, and death. And these three faces of suffering were pivotal for him in leading to the teachings of the Buddhist tradition, which are remarkable teachings, whether you adopt them as a way of living or not. Buddhism's a beautiful thing and worthy of study and pursuit, I think. So, I guess that's behavior. One of my mentors in Christian theology was a fellow named Doug Meeks. I never talk about Doug, but he had a tremendous impact on me. And I remember a teaching that Doug put in front of me, which was, he said in a very carefully constructed way, because that's the kind of a thinker Doug is. He's still living. He's teaching at Vanderbilt in Nashville. And Doug said that the righteousness of God is God's power for life over and against sin, sickness, evil, and death. That's a big sentence. But whether it's the aging man, the sick man, and the corpse, or here in this incredible Christian theologian's painting, sin, sickness, evil, and death, these are things that we will encounter no matter how much we seek to protect ourselves from the journey of life. And there are struggles, right? This is part of what makes life hard, is sin, sickness, evil, and death, or aging. You might want to add your own sort of flavors of suffering, and we'll talk about addiction at a later point in the message if I stay to my mental outline. But these are part of the human condition. It is unavoidable that we will suffer. A second thing that I brought my naivete to as a young man, not only wanting to sort of protect myself from all suffering, then in my early sobriety, moving out of atheism and into faith and becoming a chaplain, and being told by my 12-step tradition and by the Christian tradition, which I was being reared, that service was an imperative. I found myself encountering people as a chaplain, as a pastor, who were suffering, right? Near families when they had a loved one who was dying, or doing conversations with couples whose marriages were imploding, or talking to a parent whose child was off the rails, or talking to an adult whose aging parent was, struggling in other ways. This confrontation for me with the realities of suffering through my move into chaplaincy and into recovery, I wanted to believe would bear out this. And I don't know when I figured it out, but all of a sudden I figured out, you know what I thought was? I thought suffering must be sort of distributed relatively evenly. And that if you had had a life with relatively less suffering, watch out, because it was coming for you. And if you had had a life in which you'd just been like inundated with suffering, then somehow the scales of justice would give you a later time, and you could count on some sort of ultimate equanimity about this. I've had to abandon that as a principle. So not only is suffering relatively unavoidable, and I don't think it's wise to seek to avoid it too much, but also I think suffering is not evenly distributed. I have met people who have suffered inordinately more than others in ways that just move me to, tears and empathy and bewilderment and like, what? And the classic, God, why are you doing this to these people or this person or this family or this child? And this is one of the challenges of suffering, is the why question. The three-letter acronym that I won't say because I try to be very appropriate in my mind to chapel, but it starts with W. And what in the world, Lord, are you doing is a fair question that I think comes upon those who seek to bring care to people in context of suffering, and those of us who are suffering ourselves or around other people. It's like, why? And it's like, for me, I want an answer. I want to know why. Why does one person get cancer and another doesn't? Why was my brother murdered and I'm alive? Why? And I already used the expression fool's errand, but I'm going to say, I think, you can spend a ton of time on the why, but I'm not sure it's productive time. And I think that I've learned as a chaplain that when people come across their own individual answers, like, well, I guess this is my fault, or it's just random, or, it's a developmental experience, whatever. Those are the answers that you find in the historic text, the book of Job, and the Jewish scriptures. And Job does not offer a singular answer. It just pastes these different hypotheses up on the wall. My favorite, after spending way too much time dabbling in the why, is a pair of things: silence and humility. I'm moved to quiet in response to the question of why we're suffering. I don't know why. And I don't know that me, little ziggy me, against the big of the universe, why I would have presumed that I should be able to figure it out. I think that's an error of grandiosity and ego. So, and scale. The last time I addressed the topic of suffering here at Chapel, I proposed that my favorite move is not why, but so. Like, what ought we to do in the face of suffering? And I'm going to stay on that. Like, I'm sticking with it. That's my story. I'm sticking to it. Given that suffering is, it's unevenly distributed, and that it's hard to explain, we are called nonetheless to respond. And somewhere here, let me do it here, I need to interject the reality of suffering in our circumstance. Because I have the privilege of serving as the chaplain here at Caron, and Caron's existence is driven around the phenomenon of substance use disorder, of addiction. Originally they would have said alcoholism, but today we know to generalize. And addiction is a form of suffering, right? It surely is. I don't think this is offensive, but it sucks to be you. I don't mean it in a derogatory way. It sucks to be us. So, and I think it's always dangerous to measure and compare sufferings, because we each experience sufferings in our own way. And one person will say that their suffering is not so acute, but a similar person with a similar amount or circumstance will say that their suffering is extremely acute. But I think the suffering that goes with addiction is grave. And surely there's a ton of death, overdose, and suicide as a principal face of the phenomenon of addiction. And I don't know how many in the room here are like now thinking of the people that are lost, but I think of the people that are lost every day here. And I miss them and grieve. And I remember Father Bill's words, which is, some of us die that others might live. I struggle with that, but I think when I think that, I must stay sober and seek to help other people to stay sober as a response to the losses that we have suffered as a community. So that's a good one. But two other pieces of the suffering of addiction that I want to acknowledge in empathy for one another, and I think they're correlated, but one is aloneness. I think there is a fundamental aloneness that happens because of the disconnectedness from all the ways that human beings connect as the addiction spiral descends. So marriages unravel, family ties unravel, work relationships unravel, friendships erode or transform into transactional things around who, what, when, and where can I get some. And we think those are friends, but that's not friendship. So the loneliness is a piece of it. And then shame, this like horrid shame, is a part of what happens, because I think there's an inner knowing. I remember knowing very, very young that I was addicted before I had the language for it, but I knew. I was like, whoa, this is awful what's happening to me. And the experience of being hostage, of being captive. One of the depictions of addiction is often like a ball and chain tied to an ankle. And I think that captures some of the misery. of what this is. And all of that is really kind of focusing on the sorry for the downness of the message, but I'm headed somewhere. How hard it is to be a sufferer of addiction. Let me add that if you're a loved one, you have companions suffering, right? You experience them disconnecting from you. You may very well feel your own shame. What's wrong with me as a mom, a husband, a wife, a child, a friend? Like, could I have done something more? And then also feeling captive. Like you get entrapped in the mess of it. And that, people say tough love is the answer. And then you're like, that feels like cutting off your own arm. And this is a context of a rather peculiar form of misery. And, what do we do? So, what do we do? On World Religions Day, and on the weekend when we celebrate the great Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., we might listen to those voices, right? And in a way that struck me as I've fought with this theme this week. In a way, when I'm in this struggle and I don't know what to say yet on Sunday until Saturday night, I'm like, I hope this works out. It came together for me last night, was that there are 3 wisdom responses. And I'm not going to say one belongs to Judaism and one belongs to Hinduism and one belongs to Buddhism, because I don't think it works like that. I think that in my survey of wisdom traditions, these themes came forward for me, and I think that I can locate each of them across the various traditions in ways that defy that kind of simple categorization. Plus, I'm not really big on making any one tradition better than another. It's just not my style. So the 3 things are compassion, liberation, and redemption. Fancy words, but they're alternatives that present us as human beings in the context of suffering. We can extend compassion, which is, if you look at the Latin of it, and this is quite remarkable and beautiful, is to suffer with. Compassion is to accompany people in suffering. I happened to rewatch a peculiar movie. It's tied to a peculiar book. Took a lot of sway. It's called The Shack. I don't know if you know anything about it, but I watched it this week and bawling halfway through this thing. It's an interesting depiction of Christian theology and of a father who loses a daughter and is asking the why question. And the God answer in that context is, I always was with you. I was with your daughter, and I was with the perpetrator. I struggle with that, of course, but it's a part of that tradition's message of accompaniment. In fact, in that tradition, the divine leaps into the middle of human history to experience this. And so compassion is something that we can do, and we do that here, right? You are here, people who are here for family education are manifesting compassion to their loved one who is suffering as well. So, yay, you're on the right track. Liberation. Of course, it has notes of, war and battle and slavery and freedom, and those are beautiful themes. I thought one of the things that was interesting, I listened to, sorry if that's bad grammar, I listened once again to the I Have a Dream speech, 1963, Dr. King. What a speech. And one of the things that moved me to tears was when he calls the people that are on the mall in D.C., white and persons of color, to be careful to not make the mistake that they have experienced. In other words, to not take up arms, to use nonviolent forms of resistance, rather than having the error of flipping from victim to perpetrator. And so this is the kind of liberation that I think we are also called to. The last thing we should do as family members is start taking drugs ourselves to soothe our hurt or whatever, to free ourselves from the misery of this crap. That would be the same mistake. But in the core literature of the 12-step programs, which are the text of the movements of recovery, the foundational documents of how to get and stay clean and sober, is a testimony to a new freedom and a new happiness. The ball and chain. That's what we're talking about. We're talking about freedom from active addiction. That's a direct line from Narcotics Anonymous. It's Narcotics Anonymous' one promise. Freedom from active addiction. Pouring the bottle down the sink, right? Destroying the drugs. Maybe, yes, banning oneself from the casino or from the apps or whatever, but not having to go there. That's the real freedom, is not being constrained against it, but being able to not have to go, to not have to do, to not have to, expend everything of one's life to nurse at this poison well. And we are engaged in the project of liberation here. And then redemption. I love that word. I've studied redemptive suffering as a topic in Christian theology, and yet I don't think, again, Christianity owns the terrain. I think the word is beguiling and redeeming. I usually think of it like green stamps. I don't know if any of you know what they are, but or the cancellation of a debt. And I think there are economic and financial meanings that are attached to the term. But what hit me in my study for today was that one of the people I read talked about redeeming of suffering as undoing. Wouldn't that be great if we could undo some of what has happened to bring us here? Isn't that the deep yearning of our hearts? Is that the children who have been hurt, and that the ties that have been strained, and that the embarrassments that others and we have suffered would somehow not rule today and tomorrow, but that we could feel like we have redeemed ourselves and the moment. And I am going to say that those 12 steps on the wall are a path to that. And that these other opportunities that we expose our patients and families to, like SMART and Dharma recovery and other movements of recovery, are redemption paths. But if you want to look explicitly at what that looks like in the 12 steps, it's interesting because it's like the direct making of amends. It's going right to the people we have harmed and seeking to find a new way forward that heals the hurt of the past. So you may feel like you don't understand suffering, and you may feel like suffering is unfair. All of that I'm with you on. But one of the things that I think is incredibly good news is that we have information about what to do in the face of suffering and in the face of this suffering. To love one another in accompaniment, to free one another, and to make things right. I don't know I had ever had as powerful of a hope. And I want to do it stealing from Martin Luther King Jr. because I don't want to call it a dream. I have a hope that this is possible, that we need no longer be alone, that you no longer need to be alone in the misery of the pit of alcoholic despair, and that the shackles that have bound us no longer have to hold us back and down, and that the hurts that others have suffered because of our imprisonment and our aloneness can begin to be undone one day at a time.